Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session on investing in equitable food systems and economic justice. I am Noel Didla, she, her pronouns, and joining you all today from the ancestral lands of the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Natchez peoples. It is an honor and privilege to be part of this process and facilitate this conversation with all of you joining us from many places. Hope you're all taking care of yourselves and your loved ones. And at this time, I want to take this opportunity to welcome Kibibi, Aasia, Jess, Ken, and Jed to be the conversation catalyst for this session. I'm going to tell a little bit about each of them, an interesting fact. I'm not going to read their bios. Thank you all for sharing in the chat, by the way. So Kibibi is joining us from the Detroit Food Policy Council, and she can do an impression of a baby elephant. Aasia Mohammad Castañeda with the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. An interesting fact about Aasia is that she spent 5 years working with the Zapatista indigenous movement based in the Mexican Southeast via the Chiapas Media Project in Chicago, and she loves to cook different kinds of mole. Jess Calkins with the Dane County Food Council in Wisconsin enjoys hiking, camping, and spending time outdoors. Ken Morse with the Maine Network of Community Food Councils is obsessed with networks and continues to be inspired by the World Wide Web of the Maine forests. And Jed Oppenheim with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation based in Jackson, Mississippi. The unique fact about Jed is that he can reach the top shelves of the department stores. So welcome, welcome, welcome everybody. The conversation catalysts are going to be given 5 to 7 minutes each, and they were given a set of questions around our theme. And Rachel, please share the questions we gave them in chat so that folk can understand how our conversation catalysts are weaving the story. If that's possible, please do. Otherwise, I can share too. And after they finish sharing this story, then we're all going to break up into small groups, and then we have three questions based on what was shared so that we can thematically engage in intentional small conversations, and we come back into the big group. That's when we will be via chat sharing what's that big thing that stood out for us as a question from the group discussions. So that is our plan for our time together. If we were in person, we could have continued in the hotel lobby to converse as we came out of these sessions, and probably gone into the bars down the street or stood somewhere in the courtyards and continued these conversations. But because we cannot be in person, we have to be limited by our time together. So we're trying to do as much as we can within the 90 minutes. Does that sound okay? We're gonna hear stories from the conversation catalyst, and when we go into the small groups with the help of guided questions, we are all going to share stories with one another. Does that sound okay? All right. Okay, now, so we have with us Kibibi, Aasia, Jess, Ken, and Jed. In that order, they're going to share with us their stories of how they engage in investing in equitable and just food systems. Welcome everybody, and then take it away, Kibibi.
Thank you so much, Noel. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kibibi Blount-Dorn. I am the Program Manager in Education and Engagement at the Detroit Food Policy Council. I'm coming to you from Detroit today, Michigan, indigenous lands of the Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, Peoria, Miami, and Mississauga peoples. And so I'm gonna just give a little bit of background about Detroit Food Policy Council. We're organized as an independent nonprofit organization, which was founded in 2009 by a coalition of grassroots organizations in the city working on food access and food equity issues. We have 24 members that serve on our council, representing specific sectors, government bodies, and community interests. And we have 3 paid staff members. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Detroit, we have a population of around 700,000, between 600,000 and 700,000. And about 80% of our population are Black or other marginalized racial groups, and with about 40% of households qualifying for food assistance benefits. So I'll talk a little bit about our work around advancing racial equity and economically just funding strategies. So this is a relatively new area for us in terms of grant making and funding. We have recently had opportunities to do some granting of larger pools of funds. And from our experience working with organizations in the city, the organizations doing incredible work to advance racial and economic equity tend to be small, hyper local, community-based organizations or initiatives that have difficulty, accessing grants from larger funders. So last year, one of the things that we had the opportunity to do was the Food Secure Detroit program, where we redistributed funds from a large grant from the state for COVID relief. So the grants that the state was giving were grants of $1 million or more. But a lot of the organizations in Detroit that were serving emergency food access needs were smaller organizations that weren't equipped didn't have the capacity to take on such a large grant, or just didn't need that size of a grant. So we received the grant and then redistributed it to smaller organizations throughout the city. And we specifically worked with grassroots organizations that were, serving a certain number of neighborhoods that had a high level of trust in the community, and we're very familiar with the needs of the people that they were serving. So I think the things that made this successful for us is that we worked with existing relationships and a good understanding of the landscape throughout the city and the organizations that we knew would be a good fit for this funding priority. In this one example, we did have a very short amount of time to turn around and redistribute those funds. And a second thing is that we already had begun to prepare for this before the opportunity came, because we knew that there was, we had already recognized that there's this gap between what the organizations that could really excel from these types of funds, and the opportunities for them to actually get those funds from large funders. And we also had another organization that had previously been in the city called the Food and Fitness Collaborative that could kind of help us model this type of work. And the third thing is that, our values around racial equity are built into the values of our organization. So as we're forming relationships with other organizations, we're constantly asking, are looking for organizations that are Black-led, organizations that are benefiting existing residents, and organizations that are contributing to racial and economic equality in the food system. So some of the challenges that we have faced are, one of the primary things is that we find the values we have for racial equity and economic justice don't always match with the values that funders have for how we spend funds, right? So we value activities that are building trust and relationships, activities that are supporting local leadership, just as much as, the kind of criteria such as how many pounds of food are distributed or how many households are registered for programs, things like that. And we're also a small organization ourselves. So, we know going in what we're taking on, but we still are bear a heavy workload in terms of managing the grants when we take on these grants, and then we as well sometimes have a difficult time accessing the pools of funding that we think could really be beneficial to us. And I want to just close on a couple of themes or suggestions that we have. Things that we've learned from this work is to be explicit with both funders and grant seekers, that racial equity and economic justice are our priorities. And the other thing is to specifically fund the work that we know contributes to racial equity and economic justice. So funding the work of building relationships, identifying the needs of the community, developing leadership from among community members, working with community members to identify both the challenges and the solutions that are community driven and community led. Those things are the things that we explicitly are looking for as we're identifying organizations to fund.
Thank you so much, Kibibi, with that beautiful opening, giving us a glimpse into what Detroit and Detroiters are doing for themselves. Thank you so much for that. Aasia, take it away.
This pop-up, unmute myself. All right, hi everyone, buenos dias. Good day. Thank you all for this invitation. Excited to share. So my name is Aasia. I am in the so-called Chicago, the lands of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Odawa, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, as well as the Ho Chunk, Illinois, and Miami. I'm repping the Chicago Food Policy Action Council. I'm the Community Partnerships Manager here. And I began at CIFPAC on January, so I'm gonna do a little timeline as part of my story. I began January 13, 2020. So it was exactly like 2 months, March 13th, 2020 is when, there was a national emergency and everything began to shut down. I have strong, grassroots community organizing skills. So feel like it's in my DNA. So we started convening stakeholders, community partners, funders, government agencies, growers, food banks on March 18th. So 5 days, we convened hundreds of people. I had previous experience using Zoom and breakout rooms. So all that, we had that on lock for the most part, some glitches here and there. And then I want to give a shout out to the IORTA cooperative because we used their facilitation principles in order to set like a safe space and grounding for folks as we convene people. And we convene people as part of our funding strategy. Because understanding even though you have these relationships with and trust is an ongoing muscle you have to tend to. I think plurality is about a big foundation of how we organize and our strategy for understanding what the needs are in food insecure communities. So yeah, March 18th, we convened hundreds of people, we had breakout rooms, and from there, we further strategized and created different working groups. So we had a food business working group, we had a funder focused working group, and I'll get to that in a second. And then we had emergency food access. And so those were some of the working groups that we had that would then later on form their own meetings at their own frequency. Some were weekly, bi-weekly. Now for the most part, most of them are monthly or bi-weekly, but we still convene a monthly rhizome. So the whole thing was called a rhizome rapid response, in that, if you don't know, rhizomes are, see an example of a rhizome is ginger. So it grows horizontally and it shoots up and it's messy. And that's very much what organizing and building community is. And so that's what we called our rapid response efforts. And I want to say, this is all like a recipe of what we did. We had allies working in alignment with BIPOC leadership. And I want to emphasize, and part of answering this question, is that we had strong representation of BIPOC leadership that come from working class backgrounds. That's really, really important. I'm born and raised working class Chicago. My parents worked in factories. So this lens is really important because we were able to pivot and be resilient and come up with solutions really fast. We convened institutions and funders to actively listen. And we convened community partners to unapologetically voice their concerns, but also, most importantly, as in terms of advice, to quantify their needs and really quantify the needs, not make them smaller, because that's what we're used to doing to funders and foundations, to make smaller requests, but to really put it out there what it is that you need, both in terms of rapid response, but just in the overall landscape of food insecurity and food injustice. So I want to say one more point before I transition to a graphic I want to share that illustrates sort of our network and what that looks like. But from convening all these working groups, and particularly the funder working group, what then was formed or catalyzed from these convenings was the Chicago Region Food System Fund. And I'm going to put a bunch of links to our work in the chat in a minute. So the Chicago Region Food System Fund started mid-year last year, and to date has invested close to $7 million to 105 nonprofits within a 250-mile radius in Chicago. So this is the way we strategize, and this is just an immediate outcome that we're super proud of. It is a big accomplishment, but it's also at the same time just scratching the surface of what we need to do to address food insecurity. So if you can please, Rachel, share the graphic. So I wanted to share this graphic because it's colorful, very cool. But this demonstrates who, the stakeholders in our network and the stakeholders we brought together. So, in green, this is the growers, people working to support food and farm businesses that working in advocacy. The institutions represent a lot of the government agencies, including Department of Public Health, the mayor's office. Finance is not just funders and foundations, but also lenders that we work with, credit unions, health and environment, representing hospitals, clinics, and then the largest group in our network are community organizations, those working on different, work that is intersectional with food, that includes like housing. We had folks from economic development, environmental justice, mutual aid groups that were popping up, and that sort of wraps up. We had a lot of challenges, of course, as we brought folks together, making sure that people's thoughts were protected, making sure people felt safe. We did run into issues with, white supremacy culture causing harm in some of the convenings that we did, but we did revert, we went back to those IORTA principles to help guide us on how to respond and how to set the stage. So that's it for me. Thank you all. And yeah, I'll pass it back on to Noel.
Thank you, Aasia. That is incredible work you guys are doing, all in the middle of a pandemic, be it Detroit or Chicago. Everybody is moving in such intentional ways to become more self-reliant, self-determined, and creating this community-based understanding of what sovereignty looks like, what justice and equity look like in our communities. So beautiful. Thank you all for this kind of knowledge we are able to learn and continue to grow in our learning. Thank you. Next up is Jess from Dane County Food Council in Wisconsin.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Guffey Calkins, and my pronouns are she, her. I live in Madison, Wisconsin on ancestral Ho-Chunk land, and I work for the UW-Madison Extension Dane County as the community food systems educator. Part of my role includes staffing the Dane County Food Council, as Noel mentioned, which is a county government embedded council that was started in 2005 and consists of 9 members. And then we also work really closely with the City of Madison Food Policy Council, which is a city government embedded council that was started in 2012 and consists of 23 members. The piece that I wanted to highlight today that both of the councils have played a role in is a specific grant program that I'd like to talk about. So in 2014, the Madison Food Policy Council was successful in requesting a $50,000 budget item for a program called Seed Grants. And the goal of Seed Grants was to provide funding for initiatives to increase food access in the community. Earlier that same year, there had been a community-led process to examine food access needs in the community. And the process culminated in a plan with strategies and objectives to increase access to fresh and healthy food. The plan made a compelling case for focusing on food access, and it also helped garner support for securing funding for the city Seed Grant program. And the Seed Grant program has continued. It includes a major focus on funding projects that address racial equity and social justice, and projects that demonstrate financial need. Extra consideration is also given to projects that take place in what are called food access improvement areas. And these were identified in a mapping project that was updated in 2018. The budget line item has remained every year since originally in 2014 and was even temporarily increased in 2021 up to $150,000 to try to address more of the increased pandemic needs. So that success on the Madison side for the seed grants is something that led the Dane County Food Council to propose a similar grant program. And that proposal came in the 2018 county budget process. And the proposal was to expand the funding access of a program like the seed grants to a larger geographic area. And originally there was county board supervisor support of the proposal, but there were some unknowns about the capacity for who would really oversee and administer the grants. And then also during that same budget process, the Dane County Office of Equity and Inclusion was looking to propose something called Partners in Equity, or also shortened to PI, grants to fund projects addressing systemic racial inequities in the criminal justice system. So an amendment was actually proposed to connect the food access grants into the PI grants under a food project subset, and the budget item did pass. The initial budget line item for the PI food project grants was $15,000 and then was increased to $20,000 in subsequent years. The PI food project grants focus on projects that increase access to healthy, local, culturally relevant food, also addressing any projects that address issues of food waste and recovery, and then ones that strengthen regional agriculture and access to land for growing food. The PI grants give priority to projects that serve Dane County communities outside of the city of Madison, as it's kind of a partner program to the grant program within the city of Madison, and also priority to projects that are impacting communities who are under-resourced by services. I think some of the successes of both of these programs is that they've gotten a lot of interest, a lot of applications from the community. And I mean, it's kind of a weird indicator, I guess, in some ways that most years, they've had many more applicants than funding available. And so although it's unfortunate to not be able to fund all the projects that apply, that interest has also demonstrated that it's a very strong community need. And so I think that has helped continue the existence of the funding for these grant programs. And so as far as the challenges go, then related to that, of course, is one challenge is making a case for even greater funding or greater support for food access, since although these grant programs do address a need in the city of Madison and in the county, the need is much greater than what the grant programs are able to account for. It's been especially challenging on the county side, and especially with budget constraints in the last couple of years due to the pandemic. Another challenge in the program is just a general challenge with grant programs in determining whether we're doing good enough outreach or the right kinds of outreach for this program, and whether we're really getting the word out to groups who could benefit from this funding. And wondering too, if there are any particular barriers for groups to be able to access this. We have tried to make the applications pretty somewhat, not overly complicated in some ways, or not trying to ask for a lot of information that isn't really needed. So trying to make the applications really accessible. So I think some of the suggestions that I would have, just based on the things that have happened in this area, is that it can be really helpful to collect data on community needs to be able to make a case for the funding that's being requested. And it's important to give detail on the conditions that need to be addressed, and especially the continued negative implications if they aren't addressed. And also, just again, based on our experience, I recommend making a strong case and outlining the capacity to be able to oversee and administer the funding, and also potentially partnering with like-minded organizations could be a way to increase chances of success. Thank you for having me. I'll turn it back to Noel.
Thank you, Jess. We're going to move on to Ken now.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thanks for having all of us to have a chance to talk about this. I work with the Maine network of community food councils, which is about 10 years old, and I've been the coordinator for that up until a couple months ago. I'm still on the lead team, but we have another coordinator who's partaking in this conference somewhere, I think. I live in Western Maine in the foothills of the White Mountains, in lands that are have been owned, really still should be owned, by the Wabanaki tribes. The network of community food councils is a grassroots network. Most of the food councils are multi-town or county councils, and they cover about half the towns in Maine, over 200 towns. The network is a mix of really small rural councils that have no paid staff, and larger, generally urban or coastal councils that often have budgets a lot bigger than the network, and multiple staff people. The network has one staff person, a coordinator that works 15 hours a week, and we devote about a third of our time to what we call shared gifting. And that's primarily what I'm going to talk about. I'll describe it in a little bit more detail, but basically it's a process of allocation to all the member councils that they all come together through this process and decide on how the money is divided up. We found it to be really helpful over the years, even though it's not a lot of money, but it really cultivates strong networking mindsets. It cultivates a sense amongst the councils that they are the network, they are the owners of the network. They're not. It's not like we have some institutional group that is stewarding the whole process. It's the peer-to-peer sharing that happens amongst the councils, and that is that it has really been strengthened by this shared gifting process. And so it transforms the power dynamics in a way from power over to power with each other. So basically the way it works with shared gifting is volunteers from the network put together a very short RFP, request for proposal, that goes out to the councils. And we do this whole thing in about a 3-week time. So it's pretty fast. that goes out to the councils. They write a 2-page proposal. They send it in. All of the proposals are then sent out to all of the councils. And then they come together in a meeting where they give a summary of their proposal, and there's discussion about that. And then we use a process using an Excel sheet or a Google Doc sheet actually to divvy up the money. And groups will say, well, we don't need any money this year, or we don't need so much money. And so what tends to happen is some of the more resourced, larger, generally councils will take less, and then the other councils, like some of the councils, the only funds they have are from these shared gifting funds, and they'll get more. We just had our annual shared gifting meeting last week, and it ranged from $1,000 to $1,600 is the gap. We used to actually have more funding. We started out with $4,000 or $5,000 allocations to each council, but we lost a funder that provided most of those funds. Plus, we keep adding councils into the network, so that has changed. Some of the real benefits of the process is it cultivates a sense of sharing, and we think of ourselves as a sharing and learning network. And so during the process, there's a lot of discussion about, oh, you want to do that? We've done that. We'll send you these documents we created. We'll support you in this way. So it's we've been doing it for 8 years. It's kind of gone beyond the focus on the money to more on the focus on supporting each other and sharing resources. And often many of the councils work on different things together. Some of the challenges, it's been a job to get funders to understand shared gifting. We would love to have more of them make larger allocations so we can reallocate through this process. But we are making headway that way, and more funders are getting it, and generally participatory grant making in general. So that has been a bit of a challenge. The other thing is that we shift, and this is something we say to the funders, we shift a certain amount of paperwork from the funders to our coordinator, our network, so that the RFPs, the proposals, the MOUs, the invoicing, all that stuff has become internal. So that's a bit of extra work and a bit of a challenge. And our network has not directly done a lot of other equity work, racial equity work, although many of our councils have done that. And one of the advantages of having such a sharing network is if a council does something like the Cumberland County Food Security Council did the racial wealth gap simulation, then often they'll talk about it at our monthly meetings, and the other councils will adopt it. The other thing is that the network was one of the original core organizers for the Maine Food Convergence, a big month-long conversation that happened 3 days a week during February and March that knit together lots and lots of parts of the Maine food systems. There's over 100 nonprofits working in Maine, and Wabanakis and other BIPOC folks were quite involved in the organizing of that work. And I'll stop there. So thanks.
Thanks, Ken. There are a couple of questions for you in chat. If you can check and respond to them in chat, that'll be great. And Jed, take us away.
Great. Thanks, Noel. Thank you for the organizers for inviting me onto this important conversation. Much appreciation. My name is Jed. I am a program officer with the W.K. Kellogg Foundation in our place-based office here in Jackson, Mississippi, on the stolen lands of the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Natchez. He, his, him, el are my pronouns. Really briefly, as an overview, we're a national foundation with a national strategy where food systems is core to that. But we're pretty clear that our food systems work is very much intertwined with our economic security work as well. And I think that's a really important point to consider when thinking about our local Mississippi strategy work. We are, of course, an agricultural state. Over $6.5 billion a year is part of our agricultural economy. But 90% of what we eat comes from out of the state. And so right there, you start thinking about, okay, why is this, right? The big ag, the corporate farms that kind of both disenfranchise and exploit and extract from mostly Black farmers, but also our Choctaw farmers and our Vietnamese aquaculture folks down on the coast. So that kind of lends ourselves to this lens around racial equity and economic justice kind of intertwined in the Food Policy Council story here. We were lucky enough to seed a number of different organizations in the Mississippi context that I think organically kind of started to come together. The Food Policy Council for a long time had been mostly a white body, kind of in the academic sense, doing a lot of research. And we didn't really have much of a relationship with them for quite some time. But with our seeding of a number of different organizations, some of whom are on the line today, started to come together and rethink what a food policy council should be. Any of them could probably tell this story a lot better than I can. But with the, thanks, Professor, for putting that in the chat. But really, there was an opportunity to kind of reshape the Food Policy Council. And after a couple of years of being dormant, yes, thank you, the beliefs, values, and principles were a core document that this collective of organizations under the Food Justice Collaborative, in partnership with a newly budding Food Policy Council, created this beliefs, values, and principles document that really drives all the work here, including ours as the Kellogg Foundation here in Mississippi. There is a recognition that the leadership had to change the Food Policy Council for it to be the entity that is needed at this time to make a more equitable food systems value chain all across the map here in Mississippi. And so you saw, and you could see even in the bottom of that document, some of the partners, the Choctaw who are represented on this call today, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, the Vietnamese boat people from down on the coast, Hijra House, which is a Muslim cultural organization here in Mississippi, South Asian immigrant woman led Food Policy Council right now. So all these pieces kind of reestablish the Food Policy Council with a much deeper racial equity lens that recognize that exploitation, extraction, and whatnot are not the ways that our food system needs to work here in Mississippi. And frankly, as the Kellogg Foundation, as a program officer, that was an easy sell, so to speak, right? When we say that we are leaning into our values around racial equity, leadership development, and community engagement, when this kind of organic body was created or recreated, we said, yeah, of course, this is exactly what we're going to support. And so in some ways, it was really easy for us to say, yes, that's what we want to do. And that's how we want to support you, and then get out of the way. I think in addressing kind of like what's made this, I think, a successful venture is we said, you know what, y'all are the experts. I am not a food systems expert. My background is in education and juvenile justice, right? And so I've been able to build some food work and some economic justice work into my portfolio of work. I am not an expert in food. I'm not an expert in food systems or whatnot. It was about listening to the community, about listening to the folks who are on the policy council, but also listening to the folks that they serve, right? In terms of what they need and how they want to make it happen. And so I would say, you know, they came to us and said, here's what we want, here's why we want it. It's your responsibility to fund us, knowing that we had a Mississippi place-based office here. And then we got out of the way. For the most part, we want to be, you know, Noel will tell you, or Liz, or Sunny, or Dorothy, all the different members of the Food Policy Council, but some of our other organizations that we support, they know that my objective is to say yes as often as possible, and be helpful as asked, right? That's really important to us. I think that comes through building trust and building relationships. We've mostly kept that. I mean, the Food Policy Council has evolved. They're building a structure through their next generation. They're working on a fellowship with the Food Justice Collaborative. Some of those fellows are on the line here. A special shout out to them. And that's really important because we recognize that in order to reverse some of these really extractive trends that really have never let up, we need to build new leaders, intergenerational leadership, led by Black, Brown, Indigenous, and immigrant folks here in Mississippi. What challenges? I mean, as y'all know, and I feel like the last person who should say this, given I work for a national funder here at the table, there's never enough resources. There's never enough money. There's never enough political will in our places, right? The irony of Mississippi is we have a lot of small white farmers who are in the legislature who still believe in extractive practices that exploit Black farmers and Indigenous farmers here. And so how do we kind of keep on building the acumen to be able to push that and both be civically engaged as well as policy and practically engaged? You know, I would say the other thing of big philanthropy that kind of becomes an inhibitor, and it's frustrating on all ends, is because a lot of the organizations who are part of food policy councils are smaller. Right now for us, we're focused on folks who are organizations who are led by people of color, is that they tend not to, because of historical exploitation and extraction, not have the same amount of resources, which means a big funder can't give them as much resources, which then kind of re-perpetuates that cycle. And so we often, almost in default, put a lot of organizations in a situation where they have to go get match funding, or they have to go build up all of these systems that they really shouldn't have to do in order to access our dollars. And so that becomes a hurdle, and it's something that we're continuously kind of trying to fight with and grapple with as we continue to do that. Lessons learned, advice. If you're a funder, you know, fund and get out of the way. I get it. We have strategies, right? Food policy councils are part of our large strategy, but as much as possible, you know, once you've put out the dollars, or even before you've put out the dollars, you know, listen to your communities, listen to the folks that you're intending to support, work through what they want to work through with you. You know, it's not about me as a program officer saying, you know, go do this. It's really about the other way around. You know, go where your community or your food policy council wants you to go, and not where the funder wants you to go. You know, I mean, the other note that I made about centering racial equity and economic justice is we have to think beyond charity and move towards justice. I think sometimes, you know, we do a lot of really important local work, you know, whether it's, you know, ideas around healthy eating, or I know in the pandemic particularly, there was a mass mobilization that was super important about getting immediate food to children, families, et cetera, et cetera. And in a lot of ways, we let the systems that made that possible off the hook, the corporate systems, the local systems, et cetera, et cetera. And so thinking about how do we move beyond that? How do you work with like your local school system to think about who their vendors are, right? Why do they keep on going to the Ciscos of the world and the Aramarks of the world when they have, you know, a dozen Black farmers who are producing, you know, specific crops that kids could be eating, et cetera, et cetera. locally. And so I would say, you know, in terms of advice, like don't be scared of taking on those challenges and working through them and taking them head on. So I'll stop there. I hope I was somewhere within time.
Thank you, Jed. Thank you so much for that, for the context for Mississippi, and also the context for how, you know, funders can be accomplices. If your funder, by the way, was friends for 10 years with you before becoming a funder, and you marched with him, you strategized with him, and he's also somebody you conspire with all the time, the work of the relationship between funder and fundee can look very different, and we are grateful for that, to have Jed with us and to be able to have that level of partnership where we are equals. Jed sees himself as our equal, we see Jed as our equal, and we have conversations that are equitable and just in order to move the work of transforming Mississippi's food systems, local and regional economies, to a place that people deserve, the way people deserve them to be, right? So please check out the links that everybody has shared. Ken has shared links, Wally has shared links from Jess's work, Aasia has shared links, and there's so much information on the work that's happening, incredible work happening in Detroit. Please check out all those links, and let's continue to build this work together. The mandate comes from the people, right? The people give us the mandate. Those of us who are in these positions, in positions of power, maybe for some, but positions where we can influence change. But we are here because of the will of the people. So let's always remember the people and their determination is at the core. My mayor, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, said that he always says this, right? He says people are experts of their economic condition. If people are experts of their economic condition, they know what they want, they know what they deserve. So as Jed said, we shouldn't be in anybody's way. All of us are supposed to do the work we are supposed to do and get out of the way. And for that, let's continue to work along the lines of equity and justice so that we are held by standards, we are held accountable, and we are principled in how we struggle to build and how we struggle to transform, right? So with that, I would say let's go into breakout sessions, and we'll share the questions for the breakout sessions. You all can get one-on-one time, intimate time with each other. So those are the 3 questions right there. What stood out to you from what the speakers presented? Briefly share a story of work that your council or organization has done, is doing to center racial equity and economic justice in your funding requests and decisions. What is the one question you have about this work, doing work racially equitable and economically just way to, with particular focus on funding strategies? Have come up for you in your small group sessions. We had a very beautiful 3-person conversation. It was wonderful. Thank you, Tessa, and for the conversation and for the questions. So please continue to share the questions in the chat. And we are at 3:12 now. Rachel, are we going to do the lingering now after people share the questions?
I figured we would go ahead and just merge into linger time since I didn't want to cut the breakout rooms too short.
Yes. Miss Jan had a question. She said, how do we get funders to get out of the way after after they fund us? That's a big question, right? So, and I see another question that Wally has posted. And somebody's asking if they can get a copy of the chat. Rachel, is there a provision for people getting a copy of the chat so that all the links and resources can be accessed by participants?
Yes, so I will be saving the chat. I'm not sure how we're going to share it out yet, but You might also be able to save it from your computer. You'll have to check, but if you go to the chat box, the bottom right-hand corner, there's a little ellipsis or 3 dots. If you click on that at the top, it should say save chat. I'm just not sure if everyone has that functionality on this Zoom session, but if so, then you can save it as well. Otherwise, we will save it and we will share it at some point. I'm just not exactly sure where and how yet.
It does say it.
Oh, great. Thank you, Ken.
Where does it save it?
So after you hit save, it should pop up saying something like show in folder. Double click that and that should show you the file, because I have a hard time finding it too on my computer.
Okay.
Lots of questions coming in. Beautiful. As the questions come in, I also want to, continue to encourage us to think about what relational work looks like, right? When we think about doing the work as food policy councils, along with a network of people and a network of organization, and then that continues to grow. Relationships at scale are something we have to think about. Aasia mentioned how, work of relationships and building trust can be messy. Yeah, struggle is real, struggle is beautiful, but as long as struggle can remain principled, right, we will continue to grow. But in order for the struggle to remain principled, that's when we have to have a foundation, and the foundation happens to be the value system that everybody inherently believes in and invests in, and that's very important. And want to shout out a regional partner that we have, Another Gulf is Possible. Another Gulf is Possible is an amazing space that is doing incredible work, and I'm going to share a link. Joisha Datta is represented here from Another Gulf. She's doing a session on storytelling tomorrow if folk are interested. That's a very, 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 there we go. We got a shout out from Jed. Love AGIP. Yes, Another Gulf is Possible. So yeah, check them out. Because we don't do the work alone, right? We all have to have partners. Who are our partners? Who are our allies? Who are our accomplices? Let's shout out all our people. So, Rachel, shall we get into downtime?
Yes, or you could have folks answer some of the questions if you want.
Yeah, however, what do you guys prefer? Let's give it back to the group. What do you guys want to do? You want to chat? You want to answer questions? It's up to you, the will of the people. Let's answer questions from Ardis. Thank you, Ardis. Ardis from Van Cleve, Mississippi, one of our fellows. So the questions here are, Rachel, you want to go through the questions? Should I go through the questions?
You're welcome to. I've saved them in the Google Doc at the bottom.
Got it. Cool. So the questions we have are, how are folks working to pay their Food Policy Council members to reduce barriers to enter and incentivize a greater diversity on councils? That's one question. Who wants to take that question? If you want to take that question, just unmute yourself and start speaking.
We pay folks with lived experience, community organizers, and communities of color in a rate that they feel is just. And that's a much higher rate than, we treat them almost like consultants because they come to these tables with lived experiences, and we want to uplift those experiences.
All right. Does anybody else wants to take on the question?
Well, I have a question. Where does that funding come from to pay them?
I hustle and try to get money from all kinds of different sources. Philanthropic, government, different sources.
Do the funders seem to understand the need for that? And does the funding then keep coming from various funders?
What works the best is when there's trust between the funders and the organized and us in terms of how we deem our budget should look like. So often we're not asked those kind of details.
Ellie, are you comfortable sharing how much you're paying people? And so for others who are thinking about doing the same, and what kind of the rate is across the country?
Well, it might depend on, where you're located. Like cost of living here is pretty expensive in San Diego. When we spoke to one of the community organizers that often get asked to sit at various different tables, she told us she hears anything from like 100 to 150. So we decided to kind of pay on the higher end just to be respectful.
Per meeting or per month? Like what's 100
per hour? Per hour.
Okay, thank you.
Are these advisors though? Or are these actual council members?
Well, we have a leadership table. Our network is pretty big, and we have a leadership body, and so that's we compensate folks that we sort of nominate to be on the leadership body that represent communities that are marginalized from our dominant food systems.
Aasia posted in chat that they pay in Chicago, they pay $16 to $32 per hour.
There's actually two Aasias. I'm in Oakland, California.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No worries.
You want to speak to that?
Yeah, I can just share. Our Food Policy Council is a fiscally sponsored project, and we are able to pay $16 to $32 per hour just every time we apply for a grant, whether it be like similar to Ellie, philanthropic, government, or just our general fundraising. Obviously, we can do what we'd like with those funds for the most part, but that's what we offer. And that scale is based on, I think, the level of involvement with the project.
Mm-hmm.
And we call folks who are on that area of our work, our resident leaders, so they can advise on our built environment work, outreach, canvassing.
Thank you, Aasia. So the next question is, how is racial equity showing up in discussions about leveraging federal relief funding to address food insecurity and other food systems issues? Any takers?
This is Nessia Noel.
Hey.
We've been talking about this. I'm a policy analyst for Change Lab Solutions. We do food systems policy and law stuff with an aim at the structural drivers of health inequities. So not a food policy council, but we do a lot of work on the national level around food systems policy and law, and what's interesting about this question is we're seeing a lot of push federal, especially relief funds, towards supporting racial justice and racial equity. And at the same time, a lot of legal challenges to the use of those funds in that way. So it's a really interesting conversation to say, how do we keep pushing this forward without, especially in a space with conservative courts, without inviting those legal challenges that might make it even harder to do that work into the future. And I don't know how much that happens at a local level, but it is a really interesting and tough conversation to have about pushing this work forward and the work that needs to be done in a way that's legally sound. Which it's just a tough space, but it's just an interesting thing. So I'd be curious to hear if that experience is mirrored at the local level, or folks have thoughts on that.
So I can say that here in Detroit, this has been happening a lot lately at the state level, which the state, is actually administering most of the federal funded programs. But so for us, this is happening in this year. Last year, the state signed onto a declaration that racism is a public health crisis, and the state also formed a state level food security council that includes a racial disparities working group. So the state has actually become very explicit in talking about how when they're working with federal relief dollars that they're distributing, that racial equity is a high priority for them. But this is really the result of the decades and decades and decades we've been talking with state elected officials, with the folks who are in the governor's office right now, and with state level agencies about issues related to, from Detroit and from other largely Black cities that are around the state, about issues related to, to public health and racial equity, to economic development and racial equity, to food access and racial equity. And so it's kind of, it's kind of a thing where like, it seems like there's been big leaps and bounds in this past 18 months, but it really is like the slow work of the last 4 decades of really kind of like pushing harder and harder and harder on it.
Thanks, Kibibi. Thank you, Aasia. Thank you both. Yeah, should we move on to the next question then, if there is anyone else who wants to add? If not, we can move on. All right. How do we increase funding to redistribute to smaller organizations when we struggle to maintain full funding for our coalition?
Well, we struggle with that here in Maine, but we've just made a decision that we're going to distribute about 1/3 of our funding. We've had funding for our network of around 100,000 a year, and more recently 30 or 40,000. But whatever it is, we're going to redistribute 1/3 of that. That's just because of who the network is and the sense of understanding of who the network is and who really owns the network. So.
Thanks, Ken. When funders start to include an equity lens in their funding decisions, could they provide specific information or a rubric of sorts on what they're looking for? Jed, that might be for you.
Yeah, we have essentially within our framework how we do that, right? We're asking questions when we're making grants about who you work with, who you partner with, what's your board look like, what vendors do you use, who are you in partnership with, we're at what are the demographics of your staff, also of your board, and a number of other questions. And so we're very clear on how we approach things. And I'll say in the Mississippi context, I actually also use the values, beliefs, and principles that was created by our grantees to think about other grants that aren't even in food, right? So here's something that's also been created from the community to say, here's where we stand and here's what we believe in. So I use that as well in documents like that to go make a grant in education or in something else like maternal and child health and whatnot. So, But
Thank
but that's not every funder. We've been very clear where we stand. But we've also been clear that we make mistakes too, and that it doesn't always play out as we plan. We also, I know I try to move as many general operations dollars as possible, but that's not always easy to do in whatever funder strategic frameworks and all this kind of stuff around targets and all these other things.
Thanks, Jed. Any other participant wants to take on that question? All right, the next question we have is, how can food councils be profit generating to sustain selves beyond charity? Is that wise? Being a social enterprise, is that wise, is the question.
I have this is Artist from the Cosmic Poetry Sanctuary. I have a short answer for that. Yeah, it's about building trust. The network will survive if you trust the process, if you trust the people that you're working with, and
You're breaking up, Artist.
there won't be necessarily but there will be a really strong network, and a bunch of leaders is what you have. That's cool.
That's right. That's right. Thanks, Artist. Anyone else wants to take on that question? Okay. Outside of city
Sorry,
or
Noel. I
hey,
have a quick answer for that. We haven't done this, but we've just talked about it and thought about it in terms of being more self-sustaining. And one of the things that we've really been focused on is, if we were to do something like that, it would have to be something that was really tied to our mission and the work that we already do, so that it's not something that kind of takes over the mission of our work in terms of building, a food sovereign city. So we have considered doing things like, leading research studies around food system issues that funders are interested in, or things like that. But we haven't tried it yet. It's just been kind of ideas.
thanks, Kibibi. Yeah, the next question is, outside of city or county budgets, what kind of funding have other councils received? Please share.
So we've never had any funding from a city or county budget. We've always been fully grant funded and funded by private donations, which is a different kind of challenge, especially because the majority of our work is personnel hours rather than like program funding. But we typically have grants from organizations such as Kellogg and Kresge, United Way, various types of organizations that are focused on food access and food security issues.
Thank you, Kibibi. There are more questions, but we are at the hour. So we're going to give you all a break so that you can come back again for the other sessions we have this evening, cultural sessions. So thank you all so much for hanging with us yesterday and today. One more day to go, and we will continue to build. We are going to curate all the information that's coming to us from all these sessions, and there will be a knowledge product or multiple knowledge products, right? So please look out for that and stay well, take care of yourselves. Let's continue to do the work of our people.